Tonight, we are going to open a door that the mythology sealed at the end of the First Age and ask what happens if it opens again. Not the door to Moria, not the Black Gate of Mordor. A different door. One that Tolkien placed at the very edge of the world, beyond the walls of the universe itself, in the place where time and space stop, and something that is not either of them begins. The door of night. The barrier between everything that exists and the timeless void. The lock on the prison that has been holding the greatest evil Tolkien ever conceived since the end of the War of Wrath, 6,000 years before the War of the Ring even began. Morgoth is in there. He has been in there for 6 millennia. And Tolkien, in his letters and in the traditions of his mythology that he never fully resolved, left open the possibility, the prophecy, really, that he would eventually come back, that the door of night was not permanent, that there would come a day when it broke. What if that day was the War of the Ring? Most people who love Tolkien know Sauron as the ultimate evil of the Lord of the Rings. And Sauron is terrifying enough. The Eye over Barad-dûr, the 9 ringwraiths, the armies of Mordor, the weight of a will that has been bending the world toward its own purposes for thousands of years. Sauron is the largest threat most readers of Tolkien's main books ever encounter. But Tolkien was explicit about the hierarchy. Sauron was not the first. Sauron was not the worst. Sauron was a lieutenant, a servant who grew enormously in power and cunning and ambition across the long centuries of his master's imprisonment, but who was, at the most fundamental level of Tolkien's mythology, a follower, the most gifted follower, the most dangerous follower, but a follower. Morgoth was the original, the Vala who turned, the primordial intelligence who heard the music of creation and decided that it should be his music, that the world being made should be made according to his design rather than Ilúvatar's, and who poured his whole self into that decision across ages of time until there was nothing left of him that was not the will to dominate and destroy. Morgoth makes Sauron look like a bad dream you can wake up from. And he is locked in a box just outside the walls of the world, in a prison that was good enough for 6,000 years, during a war that is shaking the foundations of Middle-earth more violently than anything since the War of Wrath ended and the door was sealed. What if it isn't good enough anymore? What if the tremors of the War of the Ring reach even there? What if Morgoth comes back? Settle in. This goes all the way to the beginning of everything. Part 1. What is behind the door? Before we can understand what Morgoth's return would mean, we need to understand what Morgoth is, not what he was at the end, not the dark figure chained and cast through the door of night at the conclusion of the War of Wrath. What he is at the level of his original nature before he fell and after, because the two are not as separate as you might think. Morgoth began as Melkor, and Melkor was the greatest of the Ainur. This is Tolkien being completely precise. Not the greatest of the Ainur who descended into the world, not the greatest of the Ainur of a particular order, but the greatest, the most gifted, the most powerful, the most knowledge-hungry, the most creative. He was given more of the gifts of Ilúvatar than any other being, which means he had more of everything, more imagination, more capacity for making, more intelligence, more power. And he turned, not suddenly. The Ainulindala describes the turn happening in the music of creation itself, before the world had physical form. Melkor introducing themes of his own devising that were not in harmony with Ilúvatar's design, themes of pride and will and the desire to make something that was completely his own. The turn was slow. It was so gradual that it may have been invisible to Melkor himself at the beginning. the way that any corruption is most effective when the corrupted doesn't know the corruption has begun. By the time the world was made and the Ainur descended into it, Melkor was already other than what he had been, still capable of beauty. The First Age histories show us moments where Morgoth, through his servants, creates things of terrible, dark magnificence. Still capable of subtlety and intelligence and long, patient planning of the kind that makes him something more than simply a battering ram of evil. But no longer capable of the specific quality that makes creation good in Tolkien's understanding. Creation in service of the other. Creation that gives itself away. Melkor's making was always in service of Melkor. His gifts were always ultimately about what they gave him. And as the ages passed and he invested more and more of himself in the world, in the specific way that a Vala invests himself, by pouring his will into the physical fabric of what he touches and shapes, his nature became more and more defined by that investment. Less the gifted Ainu who had turned, and more the embodiment of the turn itself. This is the thing that most discussions of Morgoth miss. He is not simply the most powerful villain in Middle-earth's history. He is more structural than that. He is the principle of the marring of creation, given will and intelligence, and the specific, terrible clarity of purpose that comes from having invested your entire being into a single project across the whole of time. When Tolkien writes, in the Silmarillion, that Morgoth's power is in the very substance of Arda itself, that he has dispersed his will into the matter of the world, that the corruption and the damage and the darkness in the world are literally made of him, are pieces of his being scattered through the fabric of everything. He is not speaking metaphorically. He means it as a technical description of what Morgoth is and what he has done. Sauron poured himself into the One Ring, a portion of his will, concentrated, externalized, embedded in a physical object that could be used against him. This was Sauron's mistake and the mechanism of his eventual defeat. Morgoth did the same thing on the scale of an entire world. Every orc made by torturing and twisting elves into something broken and dark carries Morgoth's mark in its being. Every Balrog, once the beautiful Maiar of Auli's order, corrupted and clothed in fire and shadow, carries it. The very stone of the Iron Mountains, shaped by his will over centuries of fortification, carries it. The darkness in Mirkwood, the shadows in the Barrow Downs, the specific quality of menace that Tolkien's world carries in its bones. That is Morgoth. Not just the consequence of what Morgoth did, the residue of what Morgoth is. He is in the void behind the door of night, but he is also in the world, in every piece of darkness that his ages of making have left behind. That is the paradox of Morgoth. He was imprisoned. He was never fully gone. Now, the door of night. Tolkien describes it in the oldest stratum of his mythology, in the Book of Lost Tales, in the early versions of what became the Quenta Silmarillion. And the description is consistent. A gate at the edge of the world, at the boundary between Arda and the Void, through which Morgoth was thrust at the end of the War of Wrath by the Valar. His feet were cut from under him. The chain Angainor, which had been made for him by Aule, and which had been used to bind him once before, was put on him again. And he was thrown through the door, which was locked, and Erendil was set in the sky to guard it with the light of the Silmaril, against any attempt at return. The door of night is a physical barrier in Tolkien's cosmology. It is a lock on a prison. Locks can be broken. The question of when and how it might be broken is addressed, obliquely, in the prophecy that Tolkien laid down and then struggled with for the rest of his life. The Dagor Daggorath, the last battle in which Morgoth would return and the world would be ended and remade. What we are asking tonight is not whether that prophecy is true. It is whether the conditions that prophecy describes could arrive during the War of the Ring. Whether the tremors of that war, the most violent conflict since the War of Wrath itself, could crack the door. Whether something else could crack it. Whether someone, in the desperate calculations of a war they were losing, might try to crack it. The answer is terrifying. And it begins not in the void, but in Mordor, where a servant who has grown enormously in his master's long absence feels, for the first time in 6,000 years, something he has not felt since before he became his own master. The weight of a presence that is not his. Part 2. The Crack. Here is the scenario that makes the most mythological sense, and also the most terrifying one. The War of the Ring, in its canonical form, follows a specific trajectory. Sauron's plans are built around two assumptions: that he will find the ring, and that when he finds it, he will be strong enough to use it. The ring is not simply a weapon, it is the restoration of his full power. Without it, he is operating at a fraction of his capacity. Dangerous, yes, capable of overwhelming Middle-earth by sheer accumulated force if given enough time, but the absolute omnipotent force the ring would make him. He needs the ring. In the canonical timeline, he does not get it. The events of the War of the Ring conspire through what Tolkien called providence, a pattern operating in the story that is not planned by any character within it, but that moves through the choices of free beings toward an outcome. To deny him the ring, and ultimately to destroy it. But we are asking, what if? So let us follow the thread that produces Morgoth's return, and there are two paths to it, and they are very different in what they mean. The first path is the one that most people would imagine if you gave them the premise. The door of night simply cracks. The War of the Ring is, spiritually and metaphysically, the largest violent event in Middle-earth since the War of Wrath. The armies of Mordor, the destruction being unleashed across the lands of the West, the spiritual weight of the ring operating in the world again after its long dormancy in the Anduin. All of this creates what you might call a resonance in the fabric of Arda. A vibration, and that vibration reaches even to the door of night. And the door, which was made to be strong but which Tolkien never described as indestructible, develops a crack. This path is real within the mythology, and it is frightening, but it is passive. It makes Morgoth's return something that happens to the war, an external event that everyone must respond to. The second path is far more interesting and far more disturbing, and it requires understanding Sauron at a depth that most discussions of him don't reach. Sauron knows he is losing. In the canonical timeline, Sauron does not know he is losing. His fatal miscalculation, that Aragorn must have the ring, that no being capable of finding it would not use it, keeps him focused on the wrong problem long enough for Frodo to complete the quest. He is surprised in the end not by defeat, but by the specific mode of defeat, the discovery that the ring went into the fire without ever being used as a weapon against him. But in our scenario, let us say the error happens earlier. Let us say Sauron's intelligence services are better than canonical. Let us say the Nazgul, hunting the ring's trail, report back more accurately. Let us say that Sauron, looking through the Ithil stone and through Saruman's eyes and through the Nine's distributed awareness, puts together the picture more quickly than he does in the canonical story. That the ring is being carried toward Mordor by a hobbit. That it is going to be destroyed. What does a being of Sauron's intelligence and ambition do when he fully understands that he is about to lose everything? Most beings make desperate choices. Most beings in the final moments before total defeat reach for the most extreme option available. And the most extreme option available to Sauron, the one he would never use under normal circumstances because it terrifies him, because it is the one move that would restore his master's dominance and reduce him back to servant status, because it is the one thing that could save him from defeat at the cost of everything he has built in his master's absence, is the thing he has always known how to do. He knows how to make a gate. He is a Maya of Al's order, a craftsman spirit of the highest ability. He made the One Ring. He forged Barad-dûr. He shaped the Rings of Power. He understands the deep mechanics of the world's fabric in ways that almost no other being in Middle-earth can approach. And there is a specific piece of knowledge that Sauron carries from his long service to Morgoth that nobody else in Middle-earth has. He knows where the Door of Night is. He knows what it is made of. He knows its vulnerabilities. In our most disturbing path to Morgoth's return, it is Sauron who opens the door. Not fully, not enough to free his master. Enough to make contact, enough to call, enough to ask. The call goes through, and what answers from the other side of everything is not the Melkor who was wise and bright at the beginning of creation. It is the thing that remained after 6,000 years in the void, with nothing for company but the knowledge of what he lost and what he will do when he returns. The door cracks, and through the crack, Morgoth begins to press. Part 3. What Gandalf feels first. There is a moment in the canonical War of the Ring when Gandalf returns from death. He falls into the deep water at the bottom of the Moria abyss with the Balrog, fights it for 10 days through the depths of the mountain and up its highest peak, destroys it at the summit of Zirak-Zigil, and then dies in the doing of it, and is sent back. Sent back by whom, and by what authority, is one of the deepest questions in the mythology. Tolkien is precise in his letters. Gandalf was sent back by the Valar, under Manwë's authority, because his task was not complete. He was given more than he was before. Stripped of his grey limitations, invested with the full authority of the White that Saruman had claimed and forfeited, permitted to operate without the deliberate weakness the Istari were supposed to maintain. Gandalf the White is a meaningfully different being from Gandalf the Grey. Not just more powerful, different in kind. Gandalf the Grey worked through others, never used his power directly against Sauron, moved in the margins of events rather than at their center. Gandalf the White operates openly. He breaks Saruman's staff. He rides Shadowfax to Edoras and Helm's Deep and Minas Tirith without concealment. He does not pretend to be an old man who is only slightly more than he appears. In our scenario, when Gandalf the White comes to full awareness at the summit of Zirak-Zigil, lying in the snow with the Balrog's ashes around him, and the clarity of his renewed commission clarifying his vision of the world, he feels something that Gandalf the Grey would not have had the expanded awareness to feel. He feels the crack, not as a sound, not as a vision, as a specific quality of the spiritual fabric of the world, going wrong at a level deeper than anything Sauron has done. Sauron's presence in the world is like a dark stain on a cloth, wrong, disturbing, spreading but still within the cloth. What Gandalf feels at Zirak-Zigil is the cloth itself tearing, not at any point in Middle-earth's geography, at the edge, at the place where the cloth meets the frame it hangs on, at the door of night. He lies in the snow and he understands what it means. Not fully. The full understanding will take time and consultation with those wiser than him and the piecing together of evidence that is not yet available. But the first understanding that the war he was sent back to fight is not the war he thought he was fighting, that there is something behind Sauron's shadow that is darker than Sauron's shadow. Tolkien's mythology gives Gandalf something unusual among the Istari. the specific commission of fighting the enemy's despair and resistance with hope. Olorin, as he was in Valinor before he descended into Middle-earth as Gandalf, was the Maya most associated with pity, with the specific quality of attention that responds to others' suffering without diminishment, that can hold the full weight of what is wrong in the world without breaking under it. This is what makes Gandalf who he is. This is why he was chosen. And it is tested here because what Gandalf understands, lying in the snow at the top of Zirak-Zigil, is that the war the free peoples are fighting is the last one before something so much worse that worse is barely an adequate word. That the best possible outcome of defeating Sauron might not be victory. It might be buying time. He gets up, he dresses in white, he finds Shadowfax, and the quality of his face, when Aragorn and Legolas and Gimli encounter him in the forest of Fangorn, is different from the quality of Gandalf's face in any account that any of them have ever given. Not the comfortable, wise elder warmth of Gandalf the Grey. Not even the sharp authority of Gandalf the White as they will come to know him. Something else. The quality of someone who knows exactly how large the thing bearing down on them is, and has already decided to face it anyway. Aragorn, who has the blood of Númenor and the long training of the Rangers, and the specific perceptive capacity that comes from living close to death for 87 years, notices that Gandalf's eyes look different, as if they are looking at something further away than the forest they are standing in. He is right, they are. Part 4. The Terror of Barad-dûr. Nobody in the standard discussions of Sauron adequately addresses the following fact. Sauron is afraid of his master. Not afraid in the way that a servant is afraid of an unjust master who might punish him. Afraid in the way that anyone who has served Morgoth and survived understands the nature of what they served. Sauron was the greatest of Morgoth's servants, more gifted than Gothmog the Balrog Lord, more intelligent than any of the great drakes, more trusted, more capable, more essential to Morgoth's long strategies across the First Age. He was not simply employed by Morgoth. He was, in the most significant sense available to a being of his order, formed by his service to Morgoth. What Sauron is, was shaped by millennia of learning at Morgoth's feet, of adopting Morgoth's methods and Morgoth's goals, and Morgoth's understanding of the world as the right framework for understanding everything. And he has spent the 6,000 years since Morgoth's imprisonment building an empire of his own, taking the methods and the goals and applying them without the master present to direct them, growing in power and confidence and the specific authority that comes from being not just a servant, but the most powerful thing still walking in Middle-earth. Now something is pressing against the inside of the door of night, and Sauron feels it. The ring is the mechanism of this feeling. The ring is connected to Sauron's will, and Sauron's will was shaped by Morgoth, and Morgoth's will, even diminished, even dispersed, even locked in a void prison, is the fundamental ground of everything that Sauron became. The ring is, in the deepest theological sense, a child of Morgoth's legacy. Not Morgoth's work directly, but descended from it. And when Morgoth presses against the door of night, what he is pressing through is the fabric of ardor that contains a piece of his own essence, and the ring resonates. The ring, sitting on a chain around a hobbit's neck somewhere in the wild lands between Rivendell and Mordor, suddenly feels different. It has always been heavy, always been a presence, always been the specific weight of a will that was enormous and alien, pressing against the bearer's own will in the constant patient effort to bend the bearer toward returning to Sauron. Now, it is different. The will in the ring is still Sauron's, But it is a Sauron who has felt something that he has not felt in 6,000 years, and what he has felt has frightened him in a way that is visible through the ring, like fear visible in someone's eyes. Frodo feels this change before anyone tells him anything. He is on the road somewhere between Bree and Rivendell, or later, somewhere between Rivendell and Moria, or in the dark of the mines, depending on where in the timeline we place the crack. And the ring's quality of presence changes. It becomes less directed, less singular. The previous quality of the ring's weight had been like a hand pressing specifically on him, a will focused and purposeful, pointing back toward Mordor with absolute conviction. Now it becomes something more like the ring is listening, attending to something other than him, something other than the quest, something that is coming from a direction that is not Mordor at all. Sam notices that Frodo's color goes wrong, that Frodo stops on the road and stands still for a moment, with the expression of someone who has just heard something in the dark and cannot place the direction it came from. Mr. Frodo, what is it? Frodo doesn't have an answer. Not yet. But the quality of what just passed through the ring has told him something in the specific language of dread that the ring speaks most fluently. Whatever is behind Sauron, it is awake. Meanwhile, in Barad-dûr, in the Seat of the Eye, in the tower that Sauron built with the ring's power, and that stands or falls with the ring's existence, the Eye does something it does not do at any point in the canonical story. It flinches. Part 5. The Scale Problem. Let us stop here and be precise about something, because understanding the difference in scale between Sauron and Morgoth is not just an interesting lore point. It is the structural fact that makes everything in this scenario different from the canonical story. Tolkien, in his letters, is direct about the comparison. He writes that Sauron was less than Morgoth, but this is an understatement of almost comical proportions when you look at the actual evidence. Morgoth was the greatest of the Valar, the greatest of all the Ainur, the most powerful intelligence ever to enter the physical world. Sauron was a Maya, a lesser order of divine being entirely. The gap between Vala and Maya in Tolkien's mythology is not like the gap between a king and a captain. It is like the gap between a force of nature and a very gifted man who has learned to work with forces of nature. The other Valar, individually, were all greater than Sauron. Manwë, Lord of the Winds. Ulmo, Lord of the Waters. Auli, the craftsman in whose service both Sauron and the dwarves had their origin. Oromur, the hunter. Namo, Mandos, the judge. Any one of them would have overmatched Sauron directly if the constraint on their interference in Middle-earth had been lifted. This is part of why Tolkien's cosmic story has the shape it has. The Valar are deliberately restrained from direct intervention in the fate of Middle-earth after the downfall of Númenor, leaving its history to be made by the children of Ilúvatar and the servants who were already within the world. Morgoth was greater than all of them individually, possibly greater than several of them combined. Before his fall, when his power was undispersed and fully his own, he was the closest thing to Ilúvatar himself that had walked in the physical world. By the time of the War of Wrath, when he was captured, he had dispersed most of that original power into the world, which is why the Balrogs fled and the dragons were defeated, and his armies couldn't hold against the Valar's host. He had spent himself on the marring of creation over 3 ages. But he is not empty. The part of him that was not poured into the world is in the void with him. And 6,000 years of imprisonment, while it cannot have done anything good for his state of mind, has not diminished the power that was not already spent. In the void without anything to corrupt, without anything to reshape in his own image. That power has done nothing except accumulate its own pressure. Morgoth in the void is a Vala's worth of power, with nowhere to go and nothing to do except want to come back. Now apply this to the military situation of the War of the Ring. At Helm's Deep, the alliance of Rohan and Gandalf, and the survivors of Edoras, defeats the Uruk-hai of Isengard. Victory. Costly, near run, dependent on Gandalf's arrival with Erkenbrand's riders, but real. Against Morgoth, Helm's Deep is not a defensive position. It is a collection of people standing on a rock in a storm, whose only relevance to the storm is that the storm will hit them. At the Pelennor Fields, the combined armies of Gondor and Rohan and the army of the dead defeat the armies of Mordor and Harad and the men of the East. Victory. Enormous, dramatic, eucatastrophic in Tolkien's specific sense. The unexpected turn that produces a good outcome beyond what calculation could have predicted. Against Morgoth, the Pelennor is a skirmish among insects. At the Black Gate, the armies of the West face Mordor, and buy Frodo the last few hours he needs. Not a victory in military terms. Aragorn's force is tiny and hopeless, and everyone there knows they are probably going to die. But a meaningful sacrifice, the kind of thing that stories remember. Against Morgoth, the Black Gate scenario is not a sacrifice. It is a gesture. It is the kind of thing that is not wrong to do, but that will not survive contact with the reality of what is coming by more than a few minutes. The free peoples of Middle-earth, fighting as they are in the War of the Ring with everything they have, and winning their specific victories through courage and luck and providence, have exactly no military capacity against a returned Morgoth. This is the foundational fact that Gandalf understands on Zirak-Zigil, that Aragorn will eventually understand when Gandalf explains it, and that everyone will eventually understand when Morgoth begins to actually press against the fabric of the world from inside his prison. The war they are fighting is not the war they will need to win. The question that follows from this understanding is the question that drives the rest of tonight's story. If the free peoples cannot defeat Morgoth, what can? Part 6. What the ring becomes. The One Ring is the most powerful artifact in Middle-earth during the War of the Ring. This is a fact the story builds on at every level. The ring represents Sauron's full power. Whoever wields it wields Sauron's will. And because no mind in Middle-earth is strong enough to take the ring and survive it without becoming Sauron's slave, the only safe choice is to destroy it. Now, Morgoth is pressing against the door of night, and the ring, which was made as an expression of Sauron's will, and Sauron's will was shaped by service to Morgoth, and Morgoth is attempting to return. The ring's relationship to the War of the Ring changes. Here is the thing that nobody at the Council of Elrond discusses, because it is not a scenario anyone at the Council imagined. What does the One Ring represent in a world where Morgoth is present? In Tolkien's hierarchy of powers, Morgoth does not need the ring to be more powerful than Sauron. Morgoth at any point in his history was more powerful than Sauron, with the ring could ever make him. The ring represents the restoration of Sauron's full power, which is still only a fraction of Morgoth's power. In a world where Morgoth has returned, the ring is not the supreme artifact of the age. It is a reasonably powerful instrument of a reasonably powerful being who has a much more powerful being looking over his shoulder and wanting his things. This is actually the most interesting strategic situation the scenario produces. Morgoth would want the ring. Not because he needs it for power, he doesn't, but because the ring is a piece of his servant's will externalized, and Morgoth's relationship to his servants has always been possessive. in the most total sense. What his servants make belongs to him. What his servants are belongs to him. The ring is Sauron's most important work. Therefore, Morgoth wants it. And Sauron knows this, has known it since the moment he first sensed his master pressing against the door. The ring, which he has spent the entire Third Age desperately trying to recover, now represents something different. It represents the one piece of fully realized power he has that Morgoth does not control. If Morgoth returns and the ring exists and Sauron does not have the ring, Morgoth will take it. And with the ring added to Morgoth's already incomprehensible power, Sauron will never be free of his master's dominance again. This creates a situation with no good outcomes for any of the major powers. Sauron needs the ring to use against Morgoth, which means his priority shifts from using it against the free peoples to finding it before Morgoth can. The free peoples need to destroy the ring before either Sauron gets it or Morgoth does, but destroying it while Morgoth is returning removes the only check on Morgoth's power within Middle-earth. And Morgoth wants the ring for reasons that are both practical and psychological, because he cannot abide anything that belongs to him being used by a servant without his permission. Frodo, somewhere on the path to Mordor, is carrying an object that has suddenly become the most contested thing in the history of the world, desired by three incompatible sets of intentions, and that will either save the world by being destroyed or end it by being found by someone who can use it. The weight on the chain gets heavier, not physically. In the way that the ring has always communicated changes in the situation, through the quality of its pressure on the bearer's will, through the specific character of the dread it generates, through the persistent sense of being at the center of something larger than the bearer can fully comprehend. Frodo, sitting by a fire somewhere in Emyn Muil, with Sam beside him and the ring around his neck, understands something he could not have put into words before this moment. The ring is afraid. Not in a way that will make it easier to carry, in a way that makes it more desperate, more insistent, more pressing in its demand to be used before it can be taken. Sam watches Frodo's face and doesn't like what he sees on it. "You all right, Mr. Frodo?" "There's something behind all of this," Frodo says quietly. "Something older than Sauron." Sam doesn't know what to say to that. He makes tea. Part 7. The Balrogs remember. The Balrogs died in the War of Wrath. All of them, according to the standard accounts, all but one. That one being the Balrog of Moria, who fled deep into the roots of Caradhras after the host of the Valar destroyed its kin, and who slept in the deeps until the dwarves of Moria accidentally excavated down to it 2/3 of the way through the Third Age. That one remaining Balrog, the one that Tolkien calls Durin's Bane, the one that Gandalf fights in the canonical story, is the only being in Middle-earth who remembers Morgoth directly, not through texts, not through tradition, not through the kind of inherited memory that the elves carry of the First Age as history. The Balrog of Moria was there, was in Angband when Feanor burned the ships at Losgар, was in the Iron Halls when Fingolfin came riding out of the flame of Dagor Bragolak and hammered his sword against the gates, was present in some form at Nirnaeth Arnoediad, the battle of unnumbered tears, when Morgoth emptied Angband and the elves and men of Beleriand were broken, was at the fall of Gondolin, where Ecthelion and Glorfindel gave their lives killing some of the Balrog's kin. And then Morgoth was taken, and the Balrog fled into the deep dark and slept for 3,000 years of the Second Age and 2,000 more of the Third. Woke only when Durin the Sixth came too deep with too many picks, was disturbed, was angry, killed the king of Moria, and the year after that, the king's son. made the mines of Khazad-dûm into the mines of Moria, and slept again, shallower now, in the upper dark. Until the Fellowship of the Ring came through. In the canonical story, the Balrog fights Gandalf because Gandalf is there and is a servant of the Valar, and therefore an enemy. The Balrog is something like a force of nature operating from its deep programming. Darkness and fire, and the destruction of the Valar's servants. In our scenario, when the Balrog surfaces to fight the Fellowship, and then fights Gandalf on the bridge of Khazad-dûm, when Tolkien's famous confrontation plays out in the dark between the Grey Wizard and the Shadow and Flame, something else is happening underneath the surface of the battle. Something that Gandalf, even as he delivers his famous line about the Balrog not passing, can feel through the creature's presence. The Balrog is agitated, not just by the intruders, not just by Gandalf, by something it feels through the same deep channels of Morgoth's dispersed essence in the world that Gandalf feels through his Maya awareness. The pressing against the door of night. The sense of the master still far away but getting less far. The specific quality of a creature that was made by Morgoth and still carries his mark in its being, feeling its maker stir. Balrogs are not complex. They are fire and fury and the will to destroy, wrapped in shadow, without the intelligence or patience or subtlety that made Sauron so dangerous. But they have one thing that Sauron, in his 6,000 years of independent operation, has partially lost: perfect loyalty to Morgoth. Not the calculating loyalty of someone who has weighed the alternatives and chosen the strongest side. The reflexive loyalty of a creature whose entire nature was shaped by its maker's will, and that therefore turns toward the maker the way a plant turns toward light. When Gandalf says to the Balrog, "There in the dark above the bottomless pit, you shall not pass." When the wizard draws his line in the fire and the shadow, and dares the ancient darkness to cross it, he is confronting not just Durin's bane, he is confronting the first living representative in Middle-earth of the thing that is pressing against the door of night. The first being still in the world that is fully, unreservedly, instinctively his. And somewhere in the battle that follows, in the long fight through the deeps and up the mountain, Gandalf understands something additional, that destroying this Balrog is not simply completing his quest mission. It is removing the single most resonant antenna for Morgoth's return that currently exists in Middle-earth. The Balrog, if it survived, would have been a beacon, a channel. The crack in the door of night, if it was still small and manageable, would have been dramatically wider had the Balrog of Moria been alive and active and responding to its master's call. This is why Gandalf must win. Not just for the Fellowship, not just for the quest, because the Balrog, fully awakened and responding to Morgoth, would have done more to crack the door from the inside of the world than anything Sauron could have done from Barad-dûr. He wins. He dies doing it. He is sent back. And the door of night is a little less cracked than it would have been. Part 8. Aragorn learns what he is fighting. The meeting in Fangorn Forest. Aragorn, Legolas, Gimli, following a trail that leads them into the oldest surviving forest in Middle-earth, into the presence of trees that remember the First Age, and whose roots go down to the rock that Morgoth shaped, tracking 3 hobbits they believe may still be alive. What they find instead is Gandalf the White. Not because he was looking for them, because the forest, being what it is, ancient, rooted in the world's deep history, aware of things that younger creatures cannot be aware of, arranged the meeting. The Ents in whose keeping the forest runs are the oldest speaking creatures still in the world. Their awareness is slow and deep and connected to the same geological memory that Tolkien gives to the oldest things. They know something is coming. They don't have the vocabulary for it, but they make certain meetings possible that Gandalf needed to happen. Gandalf tells Aragorn about the crack. Not in the first conversation. That is about the war as they know it, about Saruman and Rohan, and the gathering at Helm's Deep and the shape of the next battles. But in the quiet after, when the three of them and Gandalf are sitting without Theoden or Éomer present, in the grey light of a Rohan morning, then Gandalf tells them. Aragorn's reaction is not what Legolas and Gimli expect. He does not go pale or grip his sword, or show the specific military mind response of a commander reassessing a threat level. He goes very still. The quality of stillness that he has learned over 87 years of ranging in the wilderness. And that means, in the language of his body, that he is thinking very hard about something that has no obvious answer. Morgoth, he says at last. It is not a question. I felt it at Zirac-Sigil, Gandalf says. The door is not yet broken, but it is no longer as whole as it was. Legolas speaks then, and this matters because Legolas is from the Woodland Realm, the kingdom of Thranduil in Mirkwood, and Thranduil was at Dagorlad, and his people carry the memory of the last alliance in a way that the dwarves and the mortals do not. If Morgoth returns, Legolas says, the Valar will have to come. The Valar came once before, Gimli says. They won. They drowned a continent winning, Gandalf says quietly. And that was Morgoth mostly spent, mostly dispersed, 6,000 years ago. What is in the void now is 6,000 years of accumulated pressure with nowhere to go. Aragorn is still very still. How much time? Gandalf doesn't answer immediately. It depends on the ring. If Frodo succeeds and the ring is destroyed, the crack may be contained. The destruction of the ring will remove an enormous amount of metaphysical force from the world. Sauron's will, embodied, operating, amplifying the resonance between the world's fabric and Morgoth's presence in the void. Without the ring, the crack may not be enough. And if the ring is not destroyed, then Morgoth will be in the world before the next generation of men grows up. There is a long silence. Aragorn looks at the grey pre-dawn sky of Rohan, at the flat brown grass of the plains, at the distant shape of the white mountains on the horizon. He is the heir of Isildur, the heir of Elendil, the last king of the line that goes back through Gondor and Arnor to the survivors of Númenor, and through Númenor to Eärendil, and through Eärendil to Tuor, and through Tuor, all the way back to the survivors of Gondolin and Doriath, and the great wars of the First Age. He carries in his blood the history of every attempt the free peoples of Middle-earth have ever made to resist the darkness. He carries in his blood the memory of the last alliance, which defeated Sauron, and the memory of the War of Wrath, which defeated Morgoth. And what the War of Wrath cost. Then the mission, Aragorn says at last, is everything. Not the campaign, not the strategy, not the political maneuvering and the military build-up and the careful management of alliances. The mission, Frodo and the ring and the crack of doom. Gandalf nods. It always was. I know that, Aragorn says. I am telling myself again. Part 9. Sauron's Rebellion. Here is something that the mythology gives us space for and that almost no discussion of Tolkien fully explores. When Morgoth begins pressing against the door of night and Sauron feels it, Sauron does not simply submit. He rebels. Not openly. Not in a way that could be seen from outside Barad-dûr. Not in a way that any of the free people's intelligence, such as it is, could detect. But internally in the war of wills that Morgoth's pressing creates within the structure of Sauron's own being, there is a resistance. There is something in Sauron that has spent 6,000 years being the most powerful intelligence in Middle-earth, and that has not been under anyone's dominion since the War of Wrath, and that does not want to go back to that. Sauron has complicated feelings about his master. This is something Tolkien explores obliquely in his letters, and more directly in the accounts of Sauron's early history in Unfinished Tales. Sauron served Morgoth with genuine loyalty and genuine admiration for most of the First Age. He was not simply a tool in Morgoth's hand, he was an investment. Morgoth taught him, shaped him, gave him access to methods and knowledge that he would not have reached on his own. The relationship was genuinely formative, but it was also genuinely dominating. Morgoth's relationship to all his servants was ownership, not partnership. What Sauron learned from Morgoth, he learned because Morgoth wanted him to learn it, wanted him to be more capable in service of Morgoth's ends. There was never a moment in the First Age when Sauron was Morgoth's peer. Never a moment when he had the freedom to act on his own judgment when it conflicted with Morgoth's. Never a moment when the will that organized everything was anything other than Morgoth's. 6,000 years of independence. Even years spent in long rebuilding, years of patient recovery from the last alliance, years of slowly reassembling power from near nothing. 6,000 years of being the most powerful thing in the world, of making his own decisions, of building his own structures and devising his own strategies, of being the eye rather than the hand of the eye. That changes something. That builds in Sauron, despite everything that he was made to be, a kind of pride that is specifically his own. He does not want to be a servant again. This is his deepest secret. This is the thing he would never admit, that he barely admits to himself. But when Morgoth presses against the door, and Sauron feels the pressure, feels the weight of his master's return, feels the specific quality of presence that 6,000 years have not softened, and that he had almost allowed himself to forget. The first thing Sauron feels, underneath the fear, is anger. And then, because Sauron is nothing if not strategic, the anger becomes calculation. Morgoth wants the ring. If Morgoth returns and Sauron does not have the ring, Morgoth will take it. If Sauron has the ring when Morgoth returns, if Sauron has his full power restored and the ring consolidated in his grasp when his master arrives, then there is, just barely, the possibility of a different relationship than servitude. The possibility that Sauron with the ring is something like Morgoth's peer. This is the most dangerous thought Sauron has ever had. He knows it is dangerous. He knows that Morgoth, 6,000 years in the void, is not coming back in a mood for renegotiating power relationships. But he also knows that the alternative, being a servant again, being reduced to the executor of another's will, after everything he has built, is intolerable. So Sauron accelerates. The search for the ring, which was already the organizing principle of his strategy, becomes urgent in a new way. He pours resources into the hunt. He redeploys the Nazgul in patterns that seem, to the Free People's observers, like an escalation of the standard search, but that are actually something more focused. The specific desperation of a being who knows that his window for independent action may be closing, and who needs the ring before the window shuts. This has a visible effect on the War of the Ring. Sauron's forces move with a different quality of urgency in our scenario. The attack on Minas Tirith is not just the military campaign the canonical story describes, the careful application of overwhelming force against Gondor's last stronghold. It is also a feint, a distraction, a pressure on the Free Peoples designed to fragment their attention, while the Nazgul work a different problem. The Nazgul, all 9 of them, are simultaneously searching for the ring and searching for a way to answer the question that Sauron is frantically computing. How do you contain a returning Vala when you are only a Maya? The answer, when he finds it, is not reassuring. You don't. The best you can do is be the one holding the ring when he arrives. Part 10. What happens to the Nazgul? The 9 ring wraiths are extensions of Sauron's will. This is their nature and the mechanic of their existence. They are sustained by the rings they wear. The rings are linked to the One Ring. The One Ring is linked to Sauron's will, and therefore the Nazgul are extensions of Sauron's attention distributed into the physical world. They do not have independent purposes. They do not have independent judgments beyond the tactical flexibility Sauron allows them in execution of his broad directions. They are the Eye's hands. But the Nazgul, like the Balrog of Moria, were made in the First Age. The 9 great kings who received the rings were given them by Sauron, who received them from the Noldorin craftsmen of Eregion in the Second Age. But the rings themselves were forged by Celebrimbor under Anatar's instruction, and Anatar was Sauron in his fair form, and Sauron's methods came from Morgoth. The corrupting power in the rings, the power that hollowed out the 9 kings across centuries of use until nothing was left of them but wraith and will, is ultimately Morgoth's power working through several removes. The Nazgul, therefore, are not simply connected to Sauron. They are connected to Morgoth through Sauron, in the same way that the ring is connected to Morgoth through Sauron. When Morgoth presses against the door of night, the Nazgul feel it. This is not a comfortable experience for them, in whatever mode the Nazgul have experiences. The Witch King, greatest of them, most thoroughly integrated into Sauron's will, most fully invested in the war they are fighting. The Witch King, who has been operating for 6,000 years as the ultimate servant of Sauron's agenda, suddenly feels a competing claim. A presence deeper than Sauron, a will more fundamental than the will he serves. And the Witch King, unlike Sauron, does not rebel, does not calculate the odds of resistance, does not feel the specific independent pride that Sauron's 6,000 years of solitary power have given him. The Witch King was made to serve, and the master pressing against the door of night is the master who was there at the beginning of all masters. The instinct in the Nazgul turns toward Morgoth like a compass needle turns north. This is a problem for Sauron. His most powerful servant, the Lord of the Nine, the being he has trusted to execute his most critical strategies. The Witch King is starting to orient toward a different authority. Not openly, not yet, but in the subtle ways that a will connected to many other wills can be felt shifting its weight. The way a boat feels different when the passengers move to one side, Sauron can feel the Witch King's loyalty becoming less exclusively his. The Witch King leading the assault on Minas Tirith in our scenario is fighting Sauron's war, but he is also preparing. Not betraying Sauron, the concept doesn't apply to beings of the Nazgul's degree of will dissolution. But the part of the Witch King that was once a great king of men, that still carries in the wraith core of its existence the memory of what it was to be mighty and to make choices, that part is orienting toward the thing pressing at the door of night in a way that has nothing to do with strategy and everything to do with something older than strategy. The armies of Mordor at the Pelennor fight with their usual overwhelming force. The Witch King descends on Theoden, and the moment that kills the king of Rohan plays out as in the canonical story. But there is a quality about the Witch King in our scenario that the riders of Rohan notice even through their terror. His attention is not entirely on the battle. His attention is not entirely here at all. Part of it is elsewhere, oriented towards something none of them can name. Éowyn cuts off the Nazgul's head as in the canonical story. Merry's blade breaks the Witch King's defences. The Lord of the Nazgul dies. But the manner of his death is slightly different. In the canonical story, when the Witch King is destroyed, there is a great cry and a darkness passing away. and what remains is a shroud of empty arms and a broken helm. In our scenario, the manner of the death includes something that Éowyn hears and cannot explain afterward, and does not speak of until much later, when the war is over, and they are sitting in the quiet of the houses of healing. The Witch King, as he is destroyed, makes a sound that she describes only as relief. As if, at the last, being released from the war entirely, from Sauron's will, from the ring's sustaining force, from the long, hollow existence of the Wraith, is less a defeat than an escape from something that was coming, that would have been worse than anything they faced at Pelennor. She doesn't know what that means. The people she tells it to shiver and don't explain it to her either, because to explain it would require telling her what Gandalf told Aragorn on the Rohan Plain. And nobody has made the decision yet about how widely that information should be shared. Part 11. Frodo feels the pull change. Somewhere between the Eamon Muil and the Dead Marshes, somewhere in the grey waste of the land between the Anduin and Mordor, with Gollum as their guide and Faramir's encounter still ahead of them, Frodo feels the change. The ring has always pulled toward Mordor, since Rivendell, since the first day he put it on properly and felt the full weight of its intention. The ring wants to go home, to Sauron, toward the Mountain of Fire, and that pull has been the constant backdrop of every moment of the journey. The undertow beneath whatever else is happening, the specific gravity that says this direction, always this direction. Now it pulls in two directions. It is subtle. It is the kind of thing that someone who was not paying exquisite attention to the ring's quality would not notice. But Frodo has been paying exquisite attention to the ring for months, because not paying exquisite attention to it is how it kills you, and he notices. The pull toward Mordor is still there, still the primary force, still the thing organizing the ring's demand. But there is a second pull, fainter and deeper, and oriented not toward any point in Middle-earth's geography, but toward something that is outside of geography entirely. The ring is pulling toward the edge of the world. Frodo doesn't understand this. He understands the ring's pull toward Mordor. Gandalf explained it. The logic is clear. Sauron's will is the source of the ring, and the ring wants to return to its source. The second pull has no such logic. There is no explanation within the framework of what he knows that accounts for an object desiring to travel to the place where the world ends. Unless there is a source of the ring's existence that is older and more fundamental than Sauron's will. Unless the ring, which was made by a Maiar who was shaped by a Valar, carries something of the Valar in it at a level even deeper than the Maiar's intention. Unless Morgoth is in the ring, the way Morgoth is in the Balrog of Moria, and in every dark place in Middle-earth, not as the Maker, but as the ground the Maker stood on. Frodo sits down on a grey rock in the grey waste and holds the ring in his palm and looks at it. Just looks. Sam watches him from 3 feet away with the expression he always has when Frodo does this. The specific combination of concern and absolute readiness to act that is Sam Gamgee's most characteristic feature. The look that says whatever you need. I am right here. Tell me what to do. Sam, Frodo says, do you think there's something behind Sauron? Sam considers this. He is not a lore scholar. He doesn't have the deep knowledge of the mythology that Bilbo gave Frodo, and that Frodo has had supplemented by everything at Rivendell. But Sam Gamgee has the specific intelligence of someone who pays very close attention to the world as it actually is, and his answer comes from that. I think, Sam says slowly, that there's always been something behind everything bad. You go back far enough, and there's always something older, like in the old stories. Yes, Frodo says, like in the old stories. He puts the ring back on the chain. It is heavier than it was a day ago. It is heavier in the specific way that something is heavy when it has more than one weight pulling on it, when the forces acting on it are not aligned but partially opposed, creating a tension that is felt as mass. He stands up. He picks up his pack. He follows Gollum into the grey waste. And behind his eyes, in the part of his mind that is still fully his, and that the ring cannot yet reach, he is thinking about what it means that the ring is afraid of something other than its own destruction. That beneath the ring's desire to survive and return to Sauron, there is a deeper desire, something older, something that is less about what the ring wants than about what it is. He doesn't know what to do with this information, not yet, but Gandalf told him once, in the Shire what seems like 1,000 years ago, that he would find uses for things he didn't understand when he understood them. Frodo is trying very hard to believe that is still true. Part 12. The White Council's Crisis. The White Council does not meet formally during the War of the Ring. Its effective dissolution, Saruman's betrayal, Gandalf's fall and return, the dispersal of its members across the war's various fronts, makes formal meeting impossible. But there is a moment now, a scenario, when the most important members of what remains of the Council's intelligence and authority gather informally in Minas Tirith, in the brief window before the assault. Gandalf, Aragorn, Elrond's sons Elladan and Elrohir, who have come south with the Grey Company, and the presence via the Palantir of Galadriel in Lorien. Galadriel is the one who names it first, clearly and without euphemism, in the council that only 5 people in the world are party to. Morgoth is pressing against the door of night, she says through the stone's vision. Her face is unchanged from the face that has been in the world since the First Age, the face that was in Gondolin, that was in Doriath, that knew Celebrimbor and Feanor and Finrod, and the entire role of the First Age's great names as people, not as legend. I felt it first 3 weeks ago. I have been watching since. The crack is not yet wide enough for passage, but it is widening. How long? Elrohir asks. If the ring is destroyed, possibly it closes. The ring is the primary resonance. The piece of Sauron's will actively operating in the world amplifies the connection between Arda's fabric and Morgoth's presence in the void. Destroy the ring, remove that amplification, and the crack may simply not be wide enough to sustain. And if the ring is not destroyed in time, Galadriel pauses before she answers. In the pause is the weight of someone who has been thinking about this question for 3 weeks, and who has not found an answer she likes. Then the Valar must come. The silence that follows this has a specific texture. Everyone in the room knows what the Valar coming means. It is not as simple as powerful allies arriving to help. The Valar coming to Middle-earth directly means the end of the age one way or another. The last time the Valar came in force was the War of Wrath. Before that, the single combat between Tulkas and Morgoth at the beginning of the world's history. Both times the intervention of the Valar was genuine and decisive, and catastrophically costly to the physical world. The War of Wrath drowned Beleriand, a whole continent, entire civilizations, the forests that Tolkien describes as having no equivalent in later Middle-earth, gone under the sea. The great rivers, the mountain ranges, the cities, all of it under the waves, because the forces unleashed in the final conflict were too large for the geography to survive intact. Middle-earth as it exists in the War of the Ring is smaller than it was in the First Age for exactly this reason. If the Valar come again, with Morgoth having 6,000 more years of pressure built up, and the world already stressed by the War of the Ring, the cost to the geography could be significant. We don't ask them to come, Gandalf says. Not unless there is no other option. The mission continues. Frodo and the ring are the answer. If they succeed, this conversation never needed to happen. Aragorn nods slowly. And if they fail? Then I will call on Manwë myself, Galadriel says. And whatever is left of Middle-earth when the Valar are done with Morgoth will have to be enough. She pauses. Something in her expression. A quality that the people in the room have never quite seen in Galadriel's face. A quality that might be called grief of a very specific kind. Passes like a shadow. I have seen Valinor, she says quietly. I was there at the beginning. I have been in this world since the trees still gave light. I have watched everything I love destroyed once already. I do not wish to watch it again. She pauses. But I will if I must. And we will build something again from what remains. We always have. The council ends. The men of the West make the preparations for the assault on the Black Gate with the specific quality of people who know they are asking the question of their lives, whether the universe is one that rewards the attempt. Part 13. The darkness over Minas Tirith. The assault on Minas Tirith in our scenario is canonical in its broad military strokes. The vast armies of Mordor, the siege engines, the Grond, the breaching of the gate, the Rohirrim's charge, the army of the dead. But different in its atmosphere. Different in the specific quality of what the people inside the city feel. Denethor feels it most. The steward of Gondor, using his palantir against Gandalf's advice, looking into the Ithil stone that Sauron controls, and seeing through it the selective truth that Sauron wants him to see. Denethor in our scenario sees something that goes beyond the carefully curated hopelessness of the canonical account. In the canonical story, Denethor sees Sauron's armies, the fleets of the Corsairs, the overwhelming material weight of the enemy's strength. He sees truly, but selectively, and the selection breaks him. In our scenario, Denethor's Palantir sessions with the Ithil stone give him something additional. Flickers, glimpsed through Sauron's own divided attention of what is happening in the background of Sauron's thinking. In the canonical story, when Denethor looks into the stone and Sauron looks back, what Sauron is thinking about is the ring and the war. In our scenario, what Sauron is thinking about is the ring and the war and the pressing at the edge of the world, and some of that bleeds through. Denethor does not know what he is seeing when he catches these flickers. He sees imagery that doesn't correspond to anything in the Eastern campaigns, a darkness that is not Mordor's familiar darkness, a will that feels larger than Sauron's will, a sense of depth behind the eye, that the eye itself seems to be reacting to with something he can only interpret as fear. He sees Sauron afraid. He doesn't know of what. He only knows that what has been frightening the steward of Gondor for months is frightened of something else in turn. This does not, as you might expect, comfort him. It terrifies him more. If Sauron is afraid, then there is something worse than Sauron. And if there is something worse than Sauron, then everything they are doing. The resistance, the walls, the soldiers, the hope that Gondor's strength can hold long enough for something to change, is even more futile than the Palantir's curated despair had been showing him. He burns. In the canonical story, Denethor burns himself and tries to burn Faramir because he believes the world is ending, and he will not wait for it. In our scenario, he burns because he believes the world is ending, and he has glimpsed something true beneath the selective truth Sauron showed him, and the true thing is worse than the selective truth. Gandalf saves Faramir. Denethor burns. The gate falls to Grond. The Rohirrim arrive at dawn, but the quality of the siege, the quality of what the soldiers of Gondor experienced on those walls in those days, has something in it that accounts from the canonical War of the Ring don't quite capture. A depth to the darkness, a quality of cold that is not weather, and a quality of despair that is not simply fear of the enemy in front of them. A sense, barely articulable, of something enormous and patient and much older than the war they are fighting, moving in the background of events like the slow turning of a very large wheel. Many of the soldiers of Gondor afterwards say that the siege felt different from any battle they had ever fought before. Not just larger, different in kind, as if what was threatening the city was not simply an army but an intention. They are right, and they are lucky they don't know exactly what that intention is yet. Part 14. The Paths of the Dead and What They Know. The Army of the Dead. The Oathbreakers of Erech, men who swore to Isildur to fight against Sauron and then refused when the call came, and who were cursed by Isildur to walk in death until the oath was fulfilled. These are not creatures of the Third Age. They died in the Second Age. They have been in the specific twilight existence of oath-cursed dead for over 3,000 years, in the dark places under the White Mountains. What have they seen in 3,000 years of twilight existence? What does a ghost know, living in the overlap between the world of the living and whatever is on the other side of death for 3 millennia? In the canonical story, Aragorn calls them, invokes the oath, leads them to the Pelennor, breaks the Corsair fleet, and releases them. The dead fulfill the oath and go. In our scenario, when Aragorn rides into the paths of the dead, and the king of the dead stands before him in the darkness. When Aragorn lights up the dark with the light of Andúril, and names himself, and demands the fulfillment of the ancient oath. What passes between them is not only the canonical exchange. The king of the dead looks at Aragorn with the eyes of someone who has been in the twilight between life and death for 3,000 years, and who has been feeling for weeks now something pressing against the walls between existence and whatever is on the other side of them. The dead are not in the void. They are in a different part of what lies beyond the world's surface. But they can feel pressure in the barriers, and the pressure that Morgoth is exerting on the door of night is felt, distantly, by the 3,000-year-old ghost of a king who broke his oath and has been paying for it ever since. The king of the dead says something to Aragorn that is not in the canonical account. He says, after Aragorn names himself and demands the oath's fulfillment, the old darkness is stirring. Aragorn does not break stride. He does not ask what the king means because he already knows what the king means, and there is no time. But he nods once in acknowledgement of something that the king has confirmed rather than revealed. They ride out of the paths of the dead with the army of the dead at their backs, and the quality of the dead men following the heir of Isildur has something in it that the soldiers of the Corsair fleet, waiting on their black ships at Pelagia, sense even before the ships are taken. Not just the terror of the Oathbreakers, something older, as if whatever is moving in the background of the world has spoken through these ancient dead and they carry the weight of it with them. Aragorn stands on the prow of the black ship as it turns toward Minas Tirith, and he looks at the sky, at the clouds being ripped by wind that is not entirely natural, and he thinks about what he has spent his whole life preparing for. He was prepared to be king of Gondor. He was prepared to fight Sauron. He was prepared to die if necessary and to live if possible, and to govern wisely in the long years after victory if the victory came. He was not prepared for this. Nobody prepared him for this because nobody in his generation knew to prepare for this. He draws Andúril and looks at the blade and thinks about what the blade represents. The line of Isildur, the line that goes back through Elendil and through Erendil and through Tuor and Gondolin all the way to the survivors of the First Age's great wars. To the people who fought against Morgoth directly, who faced not Sauron but Morgoth himself, who paid the price the War of Wrath demanded. The blade that was used to cut the ring from Sauron's hand at the end of the Second Age. The last time someone carrying this bloodline helped push the darkness back. He sheathes it. There is a battle to win first. Part 15. The Ring in Mordor. Frodo and Sam are inside Mordor when the quality of the air changes. They have been inside Mordor before the change. Struggling through the Emyn Muil, crossing the Dead Marshes with Gollum, navigating the terrible ascent to Cirith Ungol, dealing with Shelob's lair, experiencing the catastrophe of Sam's rescue of Frodo from the tower, the long, terrible march across the plateau of Morgoth, with the ring getting heavier with every step. All of that is canonical in our scenario. The internal journey of Frodo bearing the ring toward Mount Doom is, in its specific physical and spiritual texture, the same story. Except that at some point in the approach to Mount Doom, the quality of what the ring is doing changes. The ring has always communicated its nature to Frodo through dread and heaviness, and the persistent, low-level suggestion that everything would be easier if he just stopped, if he just sat down, if he just let the ring do what it was made to do. These are Sauron's suggestions, amplified through the ring's influence. Now, there is something else underneath them. A different voice. Or not a voice. A quality of presence that is too deep and too old to be called a voice. Something that doesn't communicate in the ring's usual mode of amplifying desire and whispering to ambition. Something that communicates the way cold communicates. Not by telling you it is cold, but by being cold, by making everything in contact with it cold. Frodo experiences this as the ring getting not heavier, but more fundamental. Less an object around his neck, and more a thing that is becoming part of the world's structure in a way that the world's structure is noticing. The volcanic landscape of Morgoth, which has always been responsive to Sauron's condition. The fires burn higher when Sauron is at peak power. The smoke thickens. Is doing something different. Not responding to Sauron. Responding to something else. Mount Doom is erupting more violently than it should be. Not the constant low-level volcanic activity that has always characterized it. Actual eruption, periodic booms of energy and heat that Sam can feel in the ground through his feet, and Frodo can feel through the chain of the ring on his chest. The mountain is responding to Morgoth pressing against the door of night, in the same way that iron filings respond to a magnet moved near them. Mount Doom was where Sauron forged the ring, where Sauron poured his will into physical form, where the connection between Arda's geological fabric and Sauron's metaphysical presence was most direct. And Sauron's metaphysical presence is connected to Morgoth's. The mountain is resonating with the pressing at the edge of the world, and the ring on its chain is resonating too. Sam, who has been carrying Frodo periodically when Frodo can't walk under the ring's weight, feels none of this directly. The ring doesn't speak to Sam the way it speaks to Frodo, but Sam is the most observant person on the quest, and what he observes is that Frodo's condition is deteriorating differently than it should be. The weight should be increasing linearly as they get closer to Sauron's domain. Instead, it seems to be increasing in bursts, in waves, as if the ring is being agitated by something external rather than simply getting heavier from proximity to Sauron. "Mr. Frodo," Sam says on a grey slope with the distant bulk of the mountain ahead of them and the ash falling like grey snow. "Is the ring doing something different?" "Yes," Frodo says. His voice is the voice of someone who is exhausted in a way that goes beyond physical exhaustion, down to the level of a person whose self is being gradually separated from everything that made it a self. It's not just Sauron anymore. Sam takes a breath. He was there when Frodo spoke to Gandalf about things older than Sauron. He understood the implication at the time. He understands it better now. What do we do? Frodo looks at the mountain. It is closer now than it has ever been. The crack of doom is inside that mountain, and the crack of doom is where this ends one way or another. We do what we said we were going to do, he says. We finish it. Sam nods. He takes more of Frodo's weight onto his own shoulders. Right then, he says, come on. He has always known what to do. That has never changed. Part 16. Glorfindel. There is one being in Middle-earth during the War of the Ring who has done something that nobody else alive has done. Who has faced a servant of Morgoth directly. Not Sauron, not one of Sauron's Nazgul, but a Balrog of Morgoth's direct making. In individual combat and died doing it. And come back. Glorfindel of Rivendell. The one who died at Cirith Thorenath above Gondolin, who killed the Balrog on the cliff's edge and fell with it, whose body was carried by Thorondor to a burial place in the Echoriath, who was reincarnated in Valinor and sent back to Middle-earth in the early Third Age by the Valar. Most readers of Tolkien don't know that the Glorfindel who helps Frodo at the ford of Bruinen, who puts Frodo on his white horse and rides against the Nazgul and drives them back with fire and flood, is the same Glorfindel who died in the fall of Gondolin, First Age, 5,000 years before the events of The Lord of the Rings. Tolkien himself was uncertain about this for much of his life, wrestling with the question in unpublished essays, and settled on, yes, same person, near the end of his life. The same person. Which means that Glorfindel died fighting a Balrog of Morgoth's making, and was considered important enough to Arda's fate in the Third Age that the Valar sent him back. Which means that when Gandalf discusses the Balrog prophecy at Fornost, not by the hand of man will he fall. And when the Witch King is eventually destroyed by Éowyn, Glorfindel is the one who spoke those prophetic words. He is not simply a powerful elf lord who lives in Rivendell and goes to elven councils. He is a being with a specific and personal history with the most direct servants of Morgoth, a being who knows from direct experience, from the experience of dying in that knowledge, what facing Morgoth's creations actually costs. In our scenario, when Gandalf and Aragorn begin to understand that Morgoth is pressing against the door of night, the person they go to with their questions is not Galadriel, whose lore is vast but whose specific experience is the Council of Ages. It is Glorfindel. Because Glorfindel has been to Valinor. Recently in cosmic terms, only 3,000 years ago. He was there when the Valar who rule Valinor were still processing the aftermath of the War of Wrath. He has heard from the source in the living memory of this specific age rather than through texts from older ages, what the Valar's position is on a Morgoth return. What he tells Aragorn and Gandalf in a private room in Minas Tirith in the evening before the march to the Black Gate is not information from a book. It is the account of a person who sat in Valinor and watched the faces of the Valar when they spoke of Morgoth in the void. They are not passive, Glorfindel says. He speaks without the elvish circumlocution that sometimes makes elvish counsel feel more poetic than practical. He speaks like someone who was there. Manwë watches the door of night constantly. The eagles, Thorondor's people, the great eagles who have served as Manwë's messengers throughout all ages, they maintain a vigil at the boundary. If the door cracks far enough, there will be response. Response, Aragorn says. What kind of response? Glorfindel looks at him with the eyes of someone who has died once in service of a cause and come back, and who therefore has a very clear-eyed view of what service to a cause actually costs. The kind that reshapes the geography. The silence that follows is the silence of men who already knew this and were hoping they were wrong. There is one other thing, Glorfindel says, a prophecy that Tolkien gave to us in the oldest accounts, that some among us know and some have forgotten, and that becomes relevant in a way it has not been relevant for the whole of the Third Age. He pauses. Turin Turambar will slay Morgoth, the greatest mortal warrior of the First Age, the wielder of Gurthang the Black Blade, fated to face Morgoth at the last battle, the Dagor Dagorath prophecy. Turin is dead, Aragorn says. He is in the halls of Mandos, Glorfindel says, as are all the dead of the elder days who have not yet been released, the First Age dead who have not yet returned. The implication sits in the room with them. The halls of Mandos are Ilúvatar's choice, not the Vala's, in matters of this magnitude. The release of the First Age dead from Mandos's keeping is not something the Valar can arrange for their own purposes. But if the Dagor Dagorath is approaching, if the last battle is coming earlier than the mythology anticipated, in the middle of the Third Age rather than at the end of all things, and is there someone who could ask, Aragorn says. Glorfindel looks at him. The answer, unspoken but clear, is yes. There is someone who could ask. There is one route from Middle-earth to Valinor that a living person has travelled in the history of the world, and Aragorn carries in his blood the heritage of the person who travelled it. Eärendil, Aragorn says softly. Your ancestor, Glorfindel says, who interceded with the Valar once before for the sake of both kindreds when everything was at its worst. He pauses. Eärendil is the morning star now. He sails the sky. But he has a voice, if a voice from the world's need reached him. Aragorn is quiet for a long time. What it would take to reach Eärendil, to make a plea that transcends the normal operations of the world and goes all the way to the level of the mythology's deepest mechanisms, is not something he can calculate. But it is something to hold, something that might matter if it comes to the worst. He files it away in the part of his mind that keeps the options no one wants to use, but that need to be available when nothing else remains. Part 17. The Black Gate Speech. The March to the Black Gate. The small army of the West, inadequate in numbers for any realistic military purpose, walking toward the last gates of Mordor, to buy time for two hobbits to do the thing that will end the war. In the canonical story, Aragorn's speech before the Black Gate is the most important speech of the war. It is the moment when the king, who has been building toward his identity for 87 years, finally stands completely in it. Not as claimant, not as candidate, not as the one who might be king if conditions align. As the king. As the person who speaks for the free peoples of the world with the full authority of the line that goes back to Isildur and Elendil and Eärendil and the kindred of Lúthien. In our scenario, the speech has a different dimension, because Aragorn, standing before the Black Gate, with what he knows about Morgoth pressing at the edges of the world and about the timeline that makes the next few hours everything. Aragorn is not only making a military gesture designed to draw the eye's attention to the wrong problem. He is making a statement about what the world is and what it should be, and why the world that Tolkien was imagining is worth the cost of the fight. He speaks to his army, the eagles of Rhûn, the riders of Rohan, the soldiers of Gondor, the rangers of the north, the men and elves and dwarves assembled under the eagle banner before the Black Gate. And what he says in our scenario, in addition to the canonical elements of the speech, the acknowledgement that they are small, that the odds are hopeless, the permission given to those who wish to turn back, is this. Behind the enemy in front of us there is an older enemy, one that we cannot fight with swords, one that only one answer will contain. And the answer is not here on this plain, with this army. The answer is somewhere in the dark of Mordor, and two of the smallest people I have ever known are carrying it towards the fire. They do not need us to win this battle. They need us to keep Sauron looking the wrong direction for as long as we can stand. He pauses, looks at the gate, looks at his army. That is all we are doing here today. We are looking dangerous, and we are doing it for as long as we can. He could not frame it that way in the canonical story, because in the canonical story the people assembled there don't know about Morgoth. In our scenario, the commanders know, Éomer knows, the elves know, and the manner in which they ride to the gate has the specific quality of people doing the right thing in full knowledge of the context, rather than the specific quality of people doing the right thing in heroic ignorance of it. Both are brave. The second kind is braver. The Black Gate opens. The forces of Mordor pour out. The last stand of Gondor and Rohan and the army of the West begins. And somewhere in the dark of the plateau of Gorgoroth, far away, 2 feet scramble on grey ash. Part 18. Mount Doom. The final approach to the crack of doom is the canonical story's most intimate and most devastating sequence. Frodo barely functional, Sam carrying him on his back up the final slopes, the ring at maximum weight, Gollum attacking and being fought off by Sam while Frodo crawls the last distance to the fire. In our scenario, it is all of that, and the mountain itself is different. Mount Doom in the canonical story is a geological fact and a metaphysical one, the place where the ring was forged, the only place it can be destroyed. In our scenario, it is also a resonance point for something much older. The connection between Sauron's will embodied in the ring and the ground of Sauron's nature in Morgoth's being, pressed against the door of night from the other side. The mountain is shaking. Not just the usual volcanic activity, actual seismic shaking, the kind that comes when something very large is pressing against something very solid from the other side. The slopes that Sam is climbing are not stable. Rocks are sliding. The heat is more intense than it should be at this distance from the actual crack. The sky above Mordor is doing something that it doesn't do in the canonical story. It is tearing, not metaphorically, the dark clouds that Sauron uses to cover Mordor and block the sun. Those clouds are being disturbed from above by something that is pressing from outside the atmosphere of the world, from the place where the world's surface meets the void, and the disturbance expresses itself as tears in the cloud cover, through which something that is not exactly light comes through. Not the sun, something whiter than the sun and colder. The light of what is on the other side of the door of night, visible through the crack that has been widening across the whole of the War of the Ring. Sam looks up at this light once and then looks away. He doesn't look up again. The light does something to him that he can't articulate and doesn't want to. Something that makes him feel simultaneously very small and very specifically himself, as if being seen by something enormous and ancient and completely without the ordinary quality of attention. He looks away and focuses on Frodo's weight on his back and the slope under his feet and the next step. Frodo, on the threshold of the crack of doom, is barely Frodo anymore. The ring has been doing what the ring does over the whole length of the quest, and it is nearly done. What remains of Frodo at this moment is less a person making a choice than a person standing at the edge of an abyss between 2 claims on his will, neither of which is his own. Sauron's claim through the ring. Be mine, bring me home, let this end. And the older thing pressing through the ring from the other side. Morgoth's will dispersed in the fabric of Arda, in the volcanics of Mount Doom, in the very fire below the crack. Not speaking, not claiming, not intelligent in any interpersonal sense, but present, heavy, old, the weight of a world that has been marred since the First Age, that carries its corruption in its geology, that is made of darkness in its deeps. At the edge of the fire, Frodo claims the ring. In the canonical story, this is presented as a failure of will. The moment when the accumulated weight of the quest, the months of carrying the ring, the slow erosion of the self that the ring performs, finally overcomes Frodo's ability to choose. He doesn't throw it in, he puts it on. In our scenario, there is an additional layer to the moment. When Frodo puts on the ring and claims it, what he feels is not only the surge of Sauron's will claiming him back, the eye turning toward Mount Doom with terrifying speed. He feels the older thing too. The thing that is in the mountain's fire, that is in the void pressing against the door, that is in the ring at a level deeper than Sauron. And that older thing, felt through the ring at the moment of its claiming, is more purely terrifying than anything Sauron has ever showed him. It is the ground of the ring's existence, and the ground of the ring's existence is the marring of creation itself, concentrated, impersonal, immense, absolutely without the possibility of pity or mercy or any response to Frodo's own existence except as an irrelevant detail in a much older and much larger story. Gollum comes, as he always does, as mercy shown in a cave in the Misty Mountains 60 years ago destined him to do. He bites off Frodo's finger. He takes the ring, dancing on the edge, and the ring is his for one moment, his precious, his at last. He falls. The ring hits the fire takes it. Part 19, the moment of destruction. The ring's destruction in the canonical story produces a series of well-described effects. Sauron's will is destroyed, the Nazgul dissolve, Barad-dûr falls, the armies of Mordor lose their coherence and begin fighting themselves. The Black Gate crumbles. In our scenario, the ring's destruction produces all of that, and something else. The ring was, as we discussed, a resonance amplifier for the connection between Sauron's will and Morgoth's presence in the void. The ring operating in the world was what was making the crack in the door of night widen. Every day the ring existed and was active, every moment of the quest where Frodo bore it toward Mordor, and the ring's proximity to its maker increased the resonance. All of that was feeding the crack, keeping it open, slowly widening it. When the ring goes into the fire, the resonance stops, not gradually, instantly. The ring is destroyed in an instant. Tolkien describes the fire consuming it almost as it touches. And in the same instant, the amplification stops. Sauron's will, scattered to the winds, no longer provides the connection between Arda's fabric and Morgoth's pressing. The crack in the door of night, which had been widening steadily across the whole of the War of the Ring, suddenly has no mechanism left to widen it further. In the void, Morgoth is pressing against a door that has just stopped responding to his pressure. The light coming through the tears in the clouds over Mordor, the not exactly light from beyond the world's edge, cuts off. The tears close. The clouds, which are already dissolving with the dissolution of Sauron's will that had maintained them, close over the sky of Mordor in a different way, a natural way, the way that the aftermath of a storm closes, rather than the way that supernatural, will-maintained darkness closes. What Frodo and Sam experience lying on the slopes of Mount Doom as the mountain begins to actually erupt in the full sense. The eulogy of Sauron's empire, the geological release of all the pressure that had been building in the resonance between the ring and the volcanic fire, is the specific quality of air changing around them. The weight that had been in the atmosphere, the sense of something immense pressing on the fabric of reality from outside, is gone. Not gradually. Gone, between one breath and the next. Frodo is lying on the rock with his injured hand against his chest, and the ring's weight off his neck for the first time in months. What replaces the ring's weight is not lightness exactly. It is something that Tolkien, in the canonical story, doesn't quite capture because the canonical story doesn't have this dimension, the specific sensation of a presence you had almost stopped noticing, suddenly not being there anymore. The crack in the world that had been letting something cold and old and enormous press through from the other side of existence is closed. Frodo opens his eyes and looks up at the sky. The clouds are moving, not rushing away dramatically. They are dissolving at the edges, the way that unnatural things dissolve when the will that maintained them is gone. But beyond them, where the not exactly light had been coming through, is now just sky. Distant, smoky, the sky of a world that has been at war, but sky, not the edge of something else. Sam finds him. Sam has always found him. They hold each other on the rock while the mountain shakes around them. "It's done," Sam says. "Mr. Frodo, it's done." "Yes," Frodo says, "and something else is done too." Sam doesn't ask what. He knows. He felt the change in the air himself. "The door closed," Frodo says. "I felt it close." Part 20. What did not come through. The door of night did not open fully. Morgoth did not return. This is the outcome of the scenario, and it is worth dwelling on precisely because it was not guaranteed. It was not certain. It was contingent on a chain of events, each of which had to happen in the right order, none of which was inevitable. The Balrog of Moria had to be destroyed. If it had survived, if Gandalf had not been there or had not been strong enough, or had fallen without taking the Balrog with him, the Balrog would have been the first creature in Middle-earth to fully answer Morgoth's call. Its presence, alive and active and responding to the pressure from the void, would have been a second resonance amplifier alongside the ring. The crack would have widened faster. The timeline would have been shorter. Frodo had to carry the ring far enough into Mordor to reach the fire. If he had failed at any of the earlier stages, if Boromir had taken it, if the Nazgul had found him at Weathertop or the Shire or the Ford of Bruinen, if Shelob's lair had been his end rather than a near miss, the ring would have come to Sauron before it could be destroyed. Sauron would have his full power. Sauron would be looking for ways to use the ring to resist his master rather than ways to find the ring in someone else's hands. The timeline would have been shorter. Sam had to give the ring back. The moment in the Tower of Cirith Ungol when Sam has the ring and has held it long enough to feel its full weight. Had Sam kept it 1 hour longer, had the part of Sam that the ring was beginning to work on been given more time. What Sam was seeing in his vision of himself as a gardener to kingdoms might have deepened enough to compete with what Sam was seeing in his vision of Frodo needing it back. The timeline would have been shorter. Gollum had to be there. The mercy shown in the Misty Mountains 60 years before, the specific choice Bilbo made in the dark that produced the specific existence Gollum had been living, the long path from that cave through Dol Guldur and the Shire and Rivendell and the whole length of the quest. Had Gollum been killed at any point along the way, had the mercy not been extended, had one of the multiple attempts on his life succeeded, the ring would have been claimed at the crack of doom without the mechanism of its destruction. Frodo alone in that moment would have kept it. The timeline would have been shorter. Every link in the chain held, barely. Some of them by the margin of a single choice made in the dark, by someone who couldn't see the full picture and acted from something other than strategy. And the door of night is closed. Morgoth is in the void. He will not stop pressing. The void does not offer distraction, and the failure of this particular attempt will not reduce the accumulated pressure of 6,000 years. But the crack that opened during the War of the Ring is closed, and the conditions that produced it, the ring operating in the world as a resonance amplifier, the Balrog of Moria as a secondary beacon, the concentrated metaphysical violence of the war providing the vibration that opened the crack in the first place. Those conditions are gone. The next time Morgoth comes close to return will be when the next such confluence occurs, which, given the nature of Middle-earth and the tendency of its history toward accumulated darkness, will eventually happen. Not in the Fourth Age, not in any age that Tolkien named, but eventually. Aragorn knows this. He accepts it the way a man accepts the knowledge that he will die, fully, without denial, without allowing it to determine the character of the life he will live in the meantime. He has a kingdom to build. And the kingdom, built well, will be the best available response to the next pressing at the edge of the world when it comes. Part 21. The Eagle's Arrival. When the eagles come to Mount Doom, when Gwaihir the Windlord descends through the ash-filled sky with his people and finds Frodo and Sam on the slope, the canonical story presents this as a rescue. Gandalf calls them, they come, they save the hobbits from the eruption of Mount Doom. In our scenario, the eagles are also something else. They are Manwë's messengers, as they always have been, the great eagles serving as the hands and eyes of the Lord of the Valar in Middle-earth. And they were there for a second purpose on that day, a purpose that Gwaihir does not speak of, and that Gandalf receives in a brief exchange of glances with the great bird that no one else sees. The eagles were watching the door of night. Manwë, from Valinor, had been watching the crack widen across the War of the Ring, had been in communication with the eagles who maintained the vigil, had been following the trajectory of the resonance amplification with the specific attention of someone who knows exactly what the cost of the door's full opening would be, and who has been making calculations about the timing of intervention if it came to that. When the ring's destruction closed the crack, Manwë knew instantly. The eagles posted near the world's edge relayed the change in the barrier quality within hours. And Gwaihir, already descending toward Mount Doom to retrieve the ring-bearers as Gandalf had asked, carried in addition to the rescue mission a specific quality of purposefulness that was different from a simple errand. He is checking, verifying with his own eyes at the place where the resonance was most concentrated, that the crack is closed and not simply reduced, that the fire of Mount Doom is no longer resonating with the pressure from the other side, that the thing that came very close to returning has retreated. He picks up Frodo and Sam, which are the ostensible reason he is there. He surveys Mount Doom, which is erupting in the ordinary volcanic way now rather than the void resonance way, and registers that it is ordinary. He flies away. Manwë receives the report. The door is closed. The emergency is over. In Valinor, something happens that has not happened since the end of the War of Wrath. The Valar collectively release a tension they have been holding for months. Not relief exactly. The Valar are not susceptible to relief in the emotional sense, but the specific quality of a tension that they have been maintaining on the door of night. The vigil that has been consuming a portion of their capacity for the entire duration of the War of the Ring is stood down. That's why the world, for the first time in 6,000 years, briefly approaches something like its natural state. Morgoth contained in the void, Sauron destroyed, no great power of darkness actively working to unmake creation in real time. It will not last. It never lasts. But it is, for this moment, real. Part 22. Gandalf's last morning in Middle-earth. Gandalf sails from the Grey Havens in September of the year 3021, 2 years after the ring's destruction. He goes with the other ring-bearers, with Frodo and Bilbo, with Galadriel and Elrond and Círdan. The ship passes into the west. In the canonical story, the departure of the ring-bearers is the formal end of the Third Age, the moment when the elvish presence that has sustained the age's specific quality of enchantment finally withdraws, and the world of men begins in earnest. In our scenario, Gandalf's departure has an additional dimension, and it shows in the quality of his face at the Havens. He knows what almost happened. He has known since Zirak-Sigil when he first felt the crack, and he has carried that knowledge through the remainder of the war. Through Helm's Deep and Minas Tirith and the Black Gate, and the long wait for news from inside Mordor, and the Eagle's return with the ring-bearers, and the great celebration of the ring's destruction. He has carried it with the specific quality of someone who has been holding a very large thing in check, and is finally, on this morning, permitted to put it down. The thing Gandalf is putting down is not only the mission, it is the vigilance. The extended attention that has been on the Door of Night ever since Zirak-Sigil, the ongoing monitoring of the crack's status, the background computation running always in his mind about the timeline and the conditions, and what would need to happen if Frodo failed. All of that is done. The crack is closed. The monitoring can stop. He stands at the dock and looks at the grey sea. Behind him, Sam Gamgee is saying goodbye to his master Frodo in the specific way that Sam says goodbye to everything, quietly, without drama, with the complete attention of someone who knows that the person in front of him is who he came here for and wants to be fully present for the moment of parting. Gandalf does not look back at this. It is a moment that is Sam's and Frodo's, and he will not dilute it with his presence. He looks at the sea. He is thinking, as he often has across the length of his time in Middle-earth, about what the world is and what it is for, about the specific theology that Tolkien built underneath his mythology, the understanding that creation is a gift from Ilúvatar to the Ainur and the children, that the gift can be marred but not unmade, that the marring is not the last word because the giver of the gift is also the ultimate sustainer of it. Morgoth marred it, has been marring it since before the First Age. The marring is real and deep and will take ages to heal, if it heals at all within the circles of the world. What happened in the last 6 months, what almost happened, is a testimony to how deep the marring goes. The door at the edge of the world was cracking, but the door held. The ring was destroyed. The hobbits, the specifically unimportant hobbits who were chosen because their very unimportance was the factor that the eye could not account for, did the thing that needed doing. And here is the Havens, and here is the ship, and here is the West. He will see Manwë. He will give his report. He will tell the Valar everything that happened and everything that almost happened and what he learned about the shape of the world's vulnerabilities in the watching. He will rest. He will be Olorin again for a while in the place where he was Olorin before Gandalf. He boards the ship. The last light of Middle-earth fades behind him. The world of men begins. Part 23. What the Fourth Age knows. Aragorn builds his kingdom. The work of the Fourth Age is the work of the canonical reign of Elessar, the restoration of Arnor, the renewal of the alliance with Rohan, the peace that is the greatest achievement of the age. But in our scenario, the Fourth Age has a dimension that the canonical Fourth Age does not. It knows what almost happened, not publicly. Aragorn did not gather the people of Gondor and Rohan and the Free Folk and tell them that during the War of the Ring, the Door of Night was cracking, and Morgoth was pressing against it from the other side. This information, if widely known, would produce one of two things. Either an existential despair that would paralyze the rebuilding they need to do, or a false sense of relief that the danger is past and will never return. Both would be wrong. Both would harm the work. What Aragorn does instead is build. He builds institutions, laws and governance, and the structures of civil society that are the Fourth Age's version of the long Elvish patience. He builds knowledge, the libraries of Minas Tirith and Annúminas, where the lore of the Third Age is preserved and expanded, where what happened and what almost happened is written down in languages that will last. He builds relationships, with Rohan and with the former enemies in Harad and in the east, the long diplomatic work of converting neighbours who were enemies into neighbours who are simply neighbours. And in the deepest levels of the institutional structure he is building, he places something that is not in the canonical Fourth Age's description. A watch, not a military watch. The days of the great enemies are over, at least for this time, and a military watch against Morgoth would be as futile as it would be misdirected. A watch of a different kind. He builds watchers of the sky, people trained in the specific discipline of noticing when the world's sky looks wrong, when the light from beyond the world's edge is visible through the clouds, when the mountains respond to pressures that are not geological, when the ring, if it ever existed again, it will not, the one ring is gone, but the knowledge of what the ring was is preserved, would need to be noticed. He builds watchers of the stories, people who know the lore of the First Age not as ancient history irrelevant to the practical concerns of men, but as operational knowledge. People who understand who Morgoth is and what the Door of Night is, and what the Dagor Dagorath prophecy says about how it ends. People who would recognize the signs if the signs came again, and who would know what needed doing. Faramir, who is the best mind in Gondor after Aragorn himself, is the architect of this institutional watchfulness. It does not have a name in the Fourth Age records that survive. Tolkien did not write the Fourth Age in any detail, but it is there, implicit in the kind of civilization that Aragorn builds. A civilization that knows what the world is, not afraid of it. That is important. Aragorn is very deliberate about this. The knowledge of Morgoth's existence and the Door of Night's vulnerability is not to be a source of paralysis. It is to be what all genuine knowledge is in Tolkien's mythology, a foundation for wise action. Something to know so that it can be responded to correctly rather than blindly. He rules for 66 years. He dies in the manner of the Númenórean kings, laying down his life when the flame of Anor is spent. He dies knowing what he built and why he built it, and that the thing he built is good. He dies knowing that the door held. Part 24. The thing that was almost opened. Let us sit with this for a moment before the end. Tolkien placed Morgoth in the void and locked the door, and then, in the oldest versions of his mythology, wrote the prophecy that the door would eventually open again. He wrote the Dagor Dagorath, the last battle, the final conflict at the end of time. As the event when Morgoth returns, when Turin Turambar rises from the dead to wield Gurthang against the first Dark Lord, when the world ends, and Ilúvatar makes it new. He struggled with this prophecy across the whole of his life. It appears in the earliest versions of the mythology and was still being discussed in the latest documents before his death. He was not certain about it. He was not certain that the eschatological framework, the world ending and being remade, was right for the mythology he was building. He was not certain that the last battle was a thing he wanted to commit to. What he was certain of was Morgoth himself, the reality of the first Dark Lord, the greatest evil, the being who poured himself into the marring of creation, was not something Tolkien ever walked back or revised into something less. Morgoth remained across all the revisions of all the texts, the largest darkness the mythology contained. The thing that Sauron was the shadow of. What tonight's scenario is really asking is not the tactical question of what Morgoth would do on the battlefield or what the Free Peoples would do against him. It is the deeper question. What does it mean that the mythology Tolkien built contains, locked away at the edge of everything, the thing that is older and worse than everything it has produced? The answer is not comfortable. It is not supposed to be comfortable. Tolkien built his mythology in the shadow of 2 world wars and the industrial mass murder that defined the 20th century. And he understood, as a man who watched those things happen, as a scholar of the Northern European tradition that understood defeat and darkness as structural features of a meaningful world, that the honest answer to what lies at the edge of things is not reassuring. What lies at the edge of things is Morgoth. What Morgoth is, in the deep structure of the mythology, is the principle of the marring itself. The accumulated damage of an intelligence that chose its own will over creation's gift. The thing that results when a consciousness as great as Melkor turns entirely inward, gives up everything that made it participate in the world's beauty, becomes defined entirely by the desire to possess and unmake. The door of night holds him. For now, the ring was destroyed, the crack closed. The emergency has passed, at least for this age, but the door is not gone. The void is not gone. Morgoth is not gone. The mythology that Tolkien built is not a mythology that ends in the clean defeat of everything dark. It is a mythology that ends, provisionally, impermanently, at the cost of enormous suffering, in the temporary containment of what cannot yet be fully healed. This is the specifically northern courage that Tolkien identified as the tradition he was working in. Not the hope that things will be fine, not the assurance that victory is inevitable. The decision to do the right thing in full knowledge that the darkness at the edge of everything is real, that the door is not indestructible, that the next time the conditions are right, the door will crack again. And to do the right thing anyway. Part 25. Why Tolkien never let him return. Tolkien knew what he had. He knew that Morgoth was the answer to a question that the mythology kept generating. The question of why evil exists, of why the world is marred, of where the darkness that every story fights actually comes from. He knew that Morgoth was the best answer to that question he had ever developed. Not a person with bad motives, not a misunderstood villain, not even simply the greatest enemy. The embodiment of the turn away from creation's gift. The concentrated expression of what it looks like when the capacity for making something beautiful is invested entirely in making something powerful. He never let Morgoth return during the Third Age because he understood, I think, that the mythology's emotional truth required the specific scale of the War of the Ring to be Frodo's scale. Not Morgoth's scale, Frodo's. The War of the Ring is not about the greatest possible darkness. It is about the most ordinary possible courage, the most ordinary possible mercy, the most ordinary possible love. Bilbo's mercy in a cave, Sam's loyalty on a mountain. Frodo's willingness to try when trying is pointless. These small things are the ones that change the world in Tolkien's mythology, and they change it precisely because the story is calibrated to a scale where they can be meaningful. Morgoth returns and the scale changes. Everything becomes a question of valor and cosmic forces and geology. The small things are still there. Frodo still needs to carry the ring. Sam still needs to carry Frodo. But they are happening in a frame that is too large for them, that tends to dwarf them, that makes it harder to see that the small thing is actually the most important thing. Tolkien kept Morgoth in the void because the story he wanted to tell was about hobbits. But he left the door of night there. He left the prophecy of the Dagor Dagorath. He left Morgoth in the void, pressing against it. And in doing so, he built into the structure of his mythology a truth that the War of the Ring embodies without stating, that the ring's destruction is not the end of the darkness, that what Frodo did matters enormously and is also not the last thing that will ever need doing. The age of men that follows is not an age of safety. It is an age of stewardship, an age of building the institutions and maintaining the knowledge and doing the work that will make the next crisis, when it comes, survivable. That is the responsibility Aragorn inherits. That is the responsibility every generation in Tolkien's mythology inherits. Not to defeat the darkness once and for all, to do the right thing in the current situation and leave the world slightly better equipped for the next. The door held. This time, the door held. Part 26. What Tolkien was saying. Let me say plainly before we end tonight what I think the scenario we have been following reveals about the mythology Tolkien was building. The Lord of the Rings, taken on its surface, is a story about the War of the Ring and the destruction of the One Ring and the defeat of Sauron. That story is true and complete and magnificent. It does not need a Morgoth subplot to be what it is. But Tolkien did not build Sauron as the ultimate evil. He built him as the secondary evil, the most powerful thing left walking in Middle-earth, yes, but secondary to something he was careful to lock away, to put on the other side of the world's edge, to make present only as a prophecy about the end of time, rather than as an active participant in the War of the Ring. Why? Because the mythology Tolkien built is not fundamentally a military story. It is a theological one, and the theology requires that the largest darkness, the oldest evil, the most complete expression of the marring of creation, be acknowledged without being the immediate problem. If Morgoth is the immediate problem, the story becomes about power. About which power is large enough to contain which other power. About the valor descending and the geography being remade and the cosmic machinery operating at its largest scale. If Morgoth is the background context, the thing pressing at the door, the deeper darkness that Sauron's shadow is a shadow of, the principle that the marring of ardor ultimately comes from, then the foreground can be what Tolkien wanted it to be, the small, the ordinary, the unexpected mercy, the love that is too specific to be amplified, the courage that is not heroic in any grand sense but simply human and present, and there, Sauron is the test. Morgoth is the ground that the test is given against, and the answer to the test is not power. It has never been power. The answer is the thing the eye cannot see. Attention organized around love rather than domination, giving rather than taking, presence rather than possession. The door of night held because the right things happened, because Bilbo was merciful and Frodo was faithful and Sam was loyal, and Gollum was given his chance, and Aragorn was willing to sacrifice himself at the Black Gate, and Gandalf was sent back when he was most needed, and Glorfindel came south from Rivendell at the ford of Bruinen at exactly the right moment, and the eagles were watching. None of these were guaranteed. All of them were chosen. Some of them were chosen by beings who had no idea that the door of night was cracking, who were simply doing the right thing for the right reason in the situation immediately in front of them. That is Tolkien's deepest point. That is the specific argument the mythology makes, over and over, from the Ainulindala to the Grey Havens. The small choices matter. The mercy shown in the dark, the loyalty given without reason, the love that does not calculate. These are the things that hold the door, not because they are powerful, because they are the opposite of what is on the other side of the door. What is on the other side of the door is the will to possess the world. What holds the door is the willingness to give the world what it needs, without demanding anything back. Two hobbits on a mountain, not because they were the strongest, because they were the most genuinely present. The door is holding. For now. Settle in. The world is larger than you thought it was, and older and darker at the edges. And there are still people, small people mostly, people that the eye would see as irrelevant, who wake up every morning and do the work that the world needs done without asking what the work will do for them. That is what holds the door. That has always been what holds the door. And it is enough.